What happens when Hollywood's most genuine star walks into what he thinks is a friendly morning show interview, only to discover it's actually an ambush designed to destroy his reputation? In just 13 seconds of brutal questioning, George Stephanopoulos would reveal his true colors and spark the most explosive confrontation in Good Morning America history. This is the exclusive inside story of how a respected news anchor lost all credibility in front of millions of viewers. The studio lights were blazing hot as Mark Wahlberg settled into the familiar interview chair across from George Stephanopoulos. The morning show host wore his trademark serious expression, but something felt different today. There was a coldness in his eyes that Mark hadn't noticed during their brief pre-show greeting. "Mark, thanks for joining us this morning," George began, his voice carrying an unusual edge. "I want to jump right into some serious questions about your past." Mark shifted slightly, maintaining his composure. "Of course, George. I'm always happy to talk about my journey and how people can change their lives around." But George wasn't interested in redemption stories today. He leaned forward aggressively, his tone becoming sharp and accusatory. "Let's talk about your criminal record. You've been arrested multiple times. You've admitted to committing hate crimes. How can you sit there and act like some kind of role model?" The studio fell silent. Camera operators glanced at each other nervously. This wasn't the gentle morning television interview anyone had expected. Mark's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "George, I've been completely open about my past mistakes. I was a troubled kid who made terrible choices, but I've spent decades trying to make amends and help other young people avoid the same path I took." George's eyes narrowed. He clearly wasn't satisfied with that response. "Making amends? You think starring in movies and making millions somehow erases what you did to innocent people?" "That's not what I said at all," Mark replied, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced as his frustration grew. "I've worked with countless youth programs. I've donated millions to charity. I've personally reached out to people I hurt to apologize and try to make things right." But George was just getting started. He shuffled through his notes dramatically, like a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. "Speaking of making things right, let's talk about your business ventures. Your restaurant chain, Wahlburgers. Reports suggest you've been cutting corners on employee benefits while you rake in profits." Mark's face flushed red. "That's completely false, George. Our employees are treated extremely well. We provide competitive wages and full benefits packages. Where are you getting this information?" "I have my sources," George replied smugly, clearly enjoying watching Mark squirm. "Sources that paint a very different picture of Mark Wahlberg than the one you like to present to the public." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Production assistants stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. This had gone far beyond normal interview boundaries. Mark leaned forward, his voice rising. "What sources, George? Show me these reports. Give me names. Because what you're describing is not only wrong, it's deliberately misleading." George smirked, sensing he had Mark on the defensive. "I think our viewers can decide for themselves what to believe. But while we're on the topic of your character, let's discuss some recent incidents on your movie sets. Multiple reports of you being difficult to work with, throwing tantrums, making unreasonable demands." "Stop right there," Mark said firmly, his patience finally wearing thin. "Those are outright lies and you know it. I've worked with the same directors and producers for years because we have great professional relationships. Ask anyone I've actually worked with, not some anonymous sources you're hiding behind." George's smile grew wider. He was clearly enjoying this character assassination. "Anonymous sources are often the most reliable, Mark. People are afraid to speak out publicly against someone with your power and influence." Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor. "This is unbelievable. I came here in good faith to talk about my new film and my charity work, and you're ambushing me with gossip and lies." "Sit down, Mark," George said condescendingly, as if speaking to a child. "We're not finished here. Actually, we are finished." Mark shot back, his voice echoing through the studio. "This isn't journalism, George. This is a hit job." George's mask was slipping now, revealing the arrogant personality beneath his polished television persona. "I'm asking the questions the American people deserve answers to. If you can't handle real journalism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." Mark's eyes blazed with anger. "Real journalism? You haven't asked me a single legitimate question. You've made a bunch of false accusations and refused to provide any evidence to back them up. That's not journalism, that's tabloid garbage." The studio audience, which had been dead silent, began murmuring among themselves. Some were clearly uncomfortable with George's aggressive tactics, while others seemed captivated by the drama unfolding before them. George sensed he was losing control of the situation, which only made him more desperate and vicious. "Let's talk about your relationship with your wife then. Sources tell me there are problems at home, marriage troubles that might explain some of your recent erratic behavior." That was the final straw. Mark's face turned bright red, and his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't you dare bring my family into this. My wife and kids have nothing to do with whatever sick game you're playing here." "Everything is fair game when you're a public figure, Mark," George replied coldly. "Your fans deserve to know who they're really supporting." Mark took a step closer to the desk, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My family is off limits, George. That's a line you don't cross." But George was drunk on power now, convinced he was delivering hard-hitting television. "I'll ask whatever questions I think are newsworthy. That's my job as a journalist." The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, with Mark struggling to maintain his composure while George continued his relentless attack. George pushed his luck one step too far, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression that would haunt his career forever. "Mark, if you can't handle these perfectly reasonable questions, maybe you should reconsider your public career altogether. The American people have a right to know about the real Mark Wahlberg." Something snapped inside Mark at that moment. His voice became eerily calm, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "You want to know about the real Mark Wahlberg, George? Let me tell you something about the real George Stephanopoulos." The color drained from George's face. For the first time in the interview, he looked genuinely concerned. "Mark, I think we should focus on you." "No, no, no," Mark said, his voice getting stronger with each word. "You open this door, buddy. You want to play this game? Let's play." You sit there acting like some moral authority. But where were you when real journalists were doing actual work? You were playing politics, spinning stories for politicians. George tried to regain control. "That's not relevant to this conversation. Everything's relevant when you're a public figure, right, George? That's what you just told me." Mark's voice was rising again, but now it was controlled anger, not desperate defense. "You want to talk about sources? Let me tell you what my sources tell me about you." The studio crew was mesmerized. Nobody had ever seen Mark Wahlberg like this, and certainly nobody had seen George Stephanopoulos looking so uncomfortable in his own studio. Mark continued his devastating counterattack. "You talk about my past like I haven't spent 25 years trying to make up for it. But what have you done to make up for your past? You spent years spinning lies for politicians, and now you pretend to be some kind of neutral journalist?" George's hands were visibly shaking now. "Mark, I think you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Mark's voice boomed through the studio. "You ambush me on live television, attack my character, bring up my family, and I'm overreacting? You know what's really overreacting? A so-called journalist who can't handle it when someone fights back." The audience was completely silent now, watching this role reversal in stunned amazement. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone could see it. Mark wasn't finished. "You want to know what real sources tell me, George? They tell me you're known around here as someone who bullies guests when the cameras are rolling but can't look them in the eye when they're off. Is that true?" George's voice cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," Mark replied sarcastically. "Just like you don't know where those anonymous sources came from. Just like you don't know why you decided to turn what was supposed to be a promotional interview into a personal attack." The studio cameras captured every moment of George's visible discomfort. His professional facade was crumbling in real time, and millions of viewers were witnessing it. Mark took a step closer to the desk again, but this time George actually leaned back in his chair. "You know what the difference is between you and me, George? I own my mistakes. I've apologized for them publicly, privately, and I work every day to be better. But you? You hide behind your desk and your title and pretend you're better than everyone else." "That's not true," George stammered weakly. "Isn't it?" Mark's eyes were blazing now. "When's the last time you admitted you were wrong about something? When's the last time you took responsibility for anything? You sit there judging everyone else, but you can't even conduct a fair interview." George tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Mark, I'm just doing my job." Mark laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "Your job? Your job is supposed to be informing the public, not character assassination. Your job is supposed to be asking tough but fair questions, not spreading gossip and lies." The studio fell silent, except for the hum of the cameras. George looked around desperately, hoping someone would rescue him, but his production team seemed frozen. Mark's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper again. "You want to know what your real job should be, George? apologizing to every guest you've ever ambushed like this, apologizing to your viewers for wasting their time with this garbage, and apologizing to real journalists everywhere for making their job harder. George's face was now bright red, and sweat was visible on his forehead. I think we should take a commercial break. Oh no, Mark said firmly. You wanted to do this on live television. We're finishing it on live television. You don't get to ambush people and then hide when they fight back. The power dynamic had completely shifted. George, who had started the interview as the confident interrogator, was now cowering behind his desk while Mark stood tall, speaking truth to power. Mark's final words cut through the studio like a knife. You know what the real tragedy is here, George? I actually respected you before today. I thought you were a legitimate journalist who might ask tough questions but would do it fairly. Instead, I found out you're just another talking head who gets his kicks from tearing people down. George could barely whisper his response. I was just trying to get answers. No, you weren't, Mark said with absolute certainty. You were trying to get ratings. You were trying to create a viral moment at my expense. Well, congratulations, George. You got your viral moment, but not the way you planned. With that, Mark Wahlberg turned and walked toward the studio exit, leaving George Stephanopoulos sitting alone at his desk, his reputation in ruins and his credibility destroyed in front of millions of viewers. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of George's humiliation as he realized that his career-defining moment had become his career-ending mistake. The studio remained dead silent as Mark disappeared through the exit doors, his dignity intact while George sat frozen, knowing that everything had changed in those final, devastating minutes.